September 27th, 2025. The waters of the Caribbean looked deceptively calm under the blanket of night, but what unfolded in those hours would turn that ocean into a battlefield. Hidden beneath the quiet surface, the United States was preparing to strike directly at two of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the planet: Venezuela's Tren de Aragua syndicate and Mexico's infamous Sinaloa cartel. Their combined operation had placed a fortune's worth of narcotics on a single disguised vessel, a floating fortress carrying not only drugs, but also armed killers and innocent lives in chains. What they believed was the perfect crime would soon erupt into a clash of gunfire, fire, and steel. The cartel ship looked like just another merchant carrier plodding through the night, but beneath the steel hull lay a staggering payload: 40 tons of narcotics, divided into 10 tons of fentanyl, 15 tons of crystalline methamphetamine, and 15 tons of pure cocaine. On American streets, this single shipment would have been valued at more than $7 billion. It was not merely contraband, it was poison, enough to saturate cities across the United States, to leave waves of overdoses and broken lives in its wake. To the cartels, it was profit. To the United States, it was a weapon aimed at its people. But the drugs weren't the only threat on board. Nearly 40 heavily armed cartel enforcers prowled the decks, equipped with AK-103 rifles, RPK light machine guns, and pistols strapped to their hips. These were not desperate smugglers, they were soldiers of crime, trained and prepared to defend their floating treasure with ferocity. And as if the drugs and the weapons weren't enough, the Americans discovered something even more horrifying. Hidden below, chained and terrified, were 5 hostages, women and children intended to be sold into human trafficking networks once the deal was done. Their fate would have been unspeakable had the night unfolded differently. Unbeknownst to the cartel gunmen pacing their decks, the ocean was not their ally. The United States Navy had been watching. From satellites far above Earth, from drones tracing invisible arcs at altitude, from signals intelligence intercepting encrypted chatter, every move of this operation had been tracked. The cartels thought the wide sea would shield them from scrutiny, but in truth, their plan had already been exposed. Washington had made a decision. The deal would not succeed. The trap was set, and soon it would snap shut. At exactly 3:10 a.m., 120 nautical miles southeast of Puerto Rico, the exchange began. 2 ships closed in on one another under the cloak of darkness. One bore the emblem of Tren de Aragua, a criminal empire that had evolved from Venezuela's prisons into a multinational syndicate of drug traffickers and killers. The other represented the Sinaloa cartel, the most feared narco organization in Mexico, infamous for its brutality and reach. This was no casual meeting. It was the largest drug deal ever attempted on the high seas, a partnership forged in greed and sealed with blood. Inside the ship's cargo hold, the drugs were stacked floor to ceiling, wrapped in thick plastic and bound in crates that gleamed faintly under dim floodlights. The sheer quantity was overwhelming. 10 tons of fentanyl alone equated to billions of lethal doses. Analysts later concluded that the fentanyl aboard that ship could have killed entire nations if distributed unchecked. The methamphetamine glistened like crystal under the lights, while the bricks of cocaine were so tightly packed they formed walls of narcotics inside the steel chamber. Above deck, guards with rifles watched the horizon, confident that the ocean was their shield. To the cartel leaders, the strategy was genius. By conducting the handoff far from borders, highways, or ports, they believed they had avoided the scrutiny of law enforcement. No street patrols, no border agents, just endless black water. It was a cloak of invisibility, or so they thought. What none of them realized was that the US Navy had been tightening its grip for nearly 2 days. Every encrypted message, every unusual maneuver on the water, every satellite ping traced back to this single moment. The American response would be precise, devastating, and impossible to escape. On the deck of a San Antonio-class amphibious ship positioned just 10 nautical miles away, sailors prepared for action. 10 RHIBs, rigid-hull inflatable boats, slid silently into the sea. Each carried 5 or 6 Navy operators armed with M4A1 carbines, MK-48 machine guns, and M110 sniper rifles mounted for overwatch. 60 men in total converged from all sides, their engines throttled low to mask their approach. Overhead, an MH-60S Seahawk hovered at 600 feet, its GAU-21 heavy machine gun trained on the cartel vessel. Observers aboard relayed every flicker of movement to the teams below, the entire operation orchestrated like a symphony of shadows. The Navy's plan wasn't built on brute force alone. It was about coordination, surprise, and timing. The sailors knew that once the trap was sprung, the cartel gunmen would fight with desperation. That meant every second mattered, every movement had to be in sync. As the RHIBs glided just outside the kill zone, sailors checked their magazines one last time. The order came through their radios. Calm, but absolute. Hold the line. On the cartel deck, bundles of narcotics were being shifted, the first stage of the transfer to the Sinaloa vessel. Cash changed hands, the night air heavy with anticipation. None of the cartel soldiers noticed the faint hum of rotor blades approaching from the distance. None realized that they were already surrounded. For a brief moment, the illusion of safety held, but only for a moment. Then, at 3:28 a.m., the illusion shattered. A blinding cone of white light ripped through the night as the Seahawk's searchlight illuminated the deck. Every shadow vanished, every disguise stripped away. A booming voice echoed through the darkness, amplified by loudspeakers. "This is the United States Navy. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." For one breathless second, the cartel fighters froze. Then, almost as if on cue, defiance took hold. A heavy machine gun barked to life, muzzle flashes tearing through the night as a DSK mounted on the deck spewed 12.7mm rounds skyward. The Seahawks shuddered under the fire as Sinaloa and Tren de Aragua gunmen leveled their rifles and unleashed wild bursts toward the sea. In an instant, the Caribbean stillness dissolved into chaos. The Navy responded with deadly precision. 10 RHIBs surged forward at 40 knots, their Mk-48 machine guns thundering. Tracers cut through the black night, sparks dancing off the hull of the narco ship as bullets ripped through metal plating. From the RHIBs, snipers with M110 rifles took their shots with ruthless calm, dropping cartel gunmen where they stood. Above, the Seahawks GAU-21 roared to life, a single strafing burst silencing the cartel's heavy machine gun nest in a storm of lead. Within 5 minutes, the scene had become a storm of fire and steel. Over 1,200 rounds cracked through the night air. Cartel fighters scrambled desperately for cover, some firing blindly into the dark, others trying to reload with trembling hands. An RPG-7 streaked from the deck, narrowly missing a Navy RHIB before detonating harmlessly in the sea, the explosion sending a wall of water into the air. But the Americans pressed forward, undeterred. The battle had begun, and the outcome was already shifting. The trap had sprung shut.
By 3:35 a.m., the Caribbean was no longer silent. The once still waters churned with gunfire, smoke, and shouting. What had started as a covert drug transfer had transformed into a full-scale battle at sea. The cartel fighters, realizing they were cornered, unleashed everything they had. Tracers slashed across the darkness, grenades clattered on the steel deck, and men screamed orders in Spanish as chaos consumed the ship. But the Americans were prepared for this exact moment. From the ribes, machine gunners unleashed relentless fire, sending waves of sparks across the narco ship's hull. Sailors crouched low, rifle steady, returning fire with precision. Each movement was drilled and practiced. These weren't random exchanges. Every shot was calculated, every burst meant to suppress and contain. The cartel, by contrast, fired wildly, their desperation blinding them to the fact that they were already losing. Overhead, the MH-60S Seahawk circled like a hawk hunting its prey. The GAU-21 heavy machine gun erupted again, its thunderous bursts shredding the last remnants of the cartel's mounted weapons. The roar of the .50 caliber echoed across the waves as glowing tracers ripped through the darkness, cutting down the smugglers who dared to hold their ground. The DSHK that had first answered the Navy's command was nothing more than twisted metal now, its gunners silenced. But the fight was far from over. The Sinaloa enforcers, hardened by years of bloodshed in Mexico, refused to give in easily. Bursts of AK-103 fire stitched the night air, bullets ricocheting off ribe hulls and splashing into the water around the sailors. Within minutes, the balance shifted even further. Several cartel gunmen fell to the deck, their bodies sprawled across crates of narcotics worth billions. The rest retreated into the ship's interior, firing blindly out of portholes as the Americans pressed harder. Smoke began to rise from the narco ship as stray rounds struck volatile cargo. Flames licked at the edges of cargo nets, and small explosions echoed through the night. The ship itself seemed to groan under the violence. The battle had escalated into something resembling open warfare. For the cartel, the illusion of control was gone. Panic began to take root. At 3:41 a.m., the fight reached its brutal peak. Cartel fighters hurled grenades in desperation, the blasts rocking the deck and rattling the steel hull. Yet the Navy pressed forward without hesitation. Every RHI closed the gap, their engines roaring as they advanced toward the target. The Seahawk above illuminated every corner of the ship, its searchlight turning night into day. There was no escape. One by one, the cartel fighters began to falter. Ammunition ran low, confidence drained away. Some dropped their rifles and screamed into radios, begging for reinforcements that would never come. Others tried to barricade themselves inside cargo holds, clutching weapons they barely had the nerve to fire. And all the while, American firepower closed in like a vice. By 3:50 a.m., the narco soldiers were breaking. The once proud alliance between Tren de Aragua and Sinaloa had dissolved into chaos. The same men who had believed the sea was their perfect shield were now trapped, surrounded, and bleeding. Flames spread across the deck as cargo nets burned. The drugs they had hoped to sell turned into fire and smoke. The order came swiftly. Boarding teams, prepare to move. The ribes surged forward, slamming into the steel hull of the cartel vessel. Hooks were thrown, ladders clanged, and within seconds, Navy sailors were scaling the sides of the ship. Boots hit steel, rifles aimed and ready, laser sights slicing through the smoke-filled air. The boarding teams moved fast, clearing corners, sweeping decks, and forcing down any resistance that dared remain. By the time they breached the deck, the cartel's will had crumbled. Dozens of fighters dropped their weapons, falling to their knees with their hands raised high. The fight had been ripped out of them. They were out of ammunition, out of hope, and staring down the full force of the United States Navy. In less than 7 minutes, the battle had shifted from chaos to surrender. But what awaited the boarding teams below deck was far worse than the gun battle. As the sailors pushed deeper into the narco ship, kicking open doors and clearing dark corridors, they found the cargo hold. Stacked from floor to ceiling were the pallets of drugs, the 40 tons of poison, wrapped tightly in film, gleaming under flashlight beams. The sight alone was staggering. Billions of dollars of narcotics, enough to devastate countless lives, sat within arm's reach. But that wasn't the only discovery. In a locked cabin sealed with reinforced steel, sailors forced their way through and stumbled upon something far darker. Chained to the walls were 5 hostages, 3 women and 2 children, their faces pale with fear, their bodies bruised and weakened. They had been destined for human trafficking networks, their lives reduced to commodities in the cartel's eyes. The rescue was immediate. Sailors cut through chains, wrapped the victims in blankets, and carried them back toward the light. For the Navy, the discovery reinforced the gravity of the mission. This wasn't just about seizing drugs. It was about breaking a network of brutality that stretched beyond narcotics. The cartels were not just traffickers. They were slavers, killers, and predators. And tonight, their fortress on the sea was collapsing. As the last hostages were secured and the deck fully cleared, a new order came down the chain of command. The narco ship was too damaged to salvage, too dangerous to tow, and far too valuable to return to cartel hands. The decision was final. It would be destroyed. Explosives were planted along the hull, sailors moving quickly to wire charges at key structural points. The ribes pulled back as the boarding teams returned, their prisoners bound and shivering in the night air. The captured cartel soldiers stared blankly, watching as their billion-dollar empire was about to be reduced to ashes. Moments later, controlled detonations erupted, ripping through the steel hull. Fire burst upward, lighting the Caribbean sky like a false dawn. The ship groaned, buckled, and then gave way, collapsing on itself as flames consumed everything inside. The ocean swallowed the remnants, leaving only smoke curling into the air. The battle was over. What had begun as a carefully disguised meeting between two of the world's most ruthless cartels ended in fire, surrender, and ruin. For the hostages, freedom had come in the form of American sailors who risked everything in the dead of night. For the cartel fighters, defeat had arrived in shackles. And for the United States, it was a message. The ocean was no safe haven for those who dared to poison its people. But the operation's end was not the end of the story. The hard drives, phones, and documents seized aboard the narco ship would soon reveal something far more sinister. Proof that this was not just a drug exchange, but part of an international network stretching far beyond the Caribbean. And that revelation would change everything.
By dawn, the Caribbean Sea had quieted again. The smoke rising from the ruined cartel ship painted a dark scar across the morning sky, a reminder of the ferocity that had torn through the night. What moments earlier had been the largest narco operation in history was now nothing more than twisted metal sinking into the depths. For the US Navy, the mission was complete. For the cartels, it was devastation. And for the world, it was proof that the ocean had become yet another battlefield. And numbers alone told a staggering story. 40 tons of narcotics were destroyed before they could ever reach American shores. 10 tons of fentanyl, enough to create 5 billion lethal doses. 15 tons of methamphetamine, each crystal shimmering like a weapon of addiction. 15 tons of cocaine, pressed into bricks that could have fueled millions of street deals. The street value was more than $7 billion, all reduced to fire and smoke in one decisive operation. For communities across America, it meant lives saved, overdoses prevented, and futures preserved. But the statistics were not limited to drugs. 30 cartel fighters were captured alive, their weapons stripped away, and their hands bound in chains. Dozens more were killed or wounded in the firefight, their bodies left among the burning cargo. And perhaps most importantly, 5 innocent hostages, 3 women and 2 children, were rescued from what would have been a nightmare of exploitation. Their survival was a human victory amid the carnage, proof that the operation was not just about destroying poison, but about saving lives. Yet the real shock came when intelligence analysts began sorting through the evidence gathered from the wreckage. Hard drives, encrypted phones, and stacks of documents recovered by boarding teams exposed connections that stretched far beyond the Caribbean. There were bank transfers totaling more than $50 million, routed through shell companies hidden in Panama and Curaçao. There were encrypted communications with operatives in Europe, pointing to distribution pipelines prepared to receive the drugs had they reached Mexico. Even more chilling, there were whispers of weapons flowing in the opposite direction, arms shipments designed to strengthen the cartels as they expanded their reach. The evidence made one fact undeniable. Tren de Aragua and the Sinaloa cartel were no longer just criminal organizations. They were global networks, building infrastructure capable of destabilizing entire nations. What the Navy had destroyed that night was more than a shipment. It was the foundation of an empire. Analysts in Washington were blunt in their assessments. Had this shipment reached American soil, it would have triggered a wave of overdoses measured not in the hundreds or thousands, but in the tens of thousands. 1 ton of fentanyl can produce over 450 million lethal doses. This ship carried 10 times that amount. The devastation would have been catastrophic. Entire cities could have been consumed by addiction, hospitals overwhelmed, morgues overflowing. The Navy's intervention had prevented a disaster of biblical proportions. But as the flames died down and the smoke drifted away, a darker question lingered. If 2 cartels acting alone could assemble this level of firepower, manpower, and narcotics, what might happen if a hostile state decided to back them? What if the next disguised cargo ship carried not drugs, but advanced weapons, explosives, or even missiles? The line between organized crime and state-sponsored aggression was blurring, and the oceans were the perfect stage. The oceans will remember what happened on that night, and they will whisper a warning to anyone who believes they can hide their crimes beneath the waves. The United States will not blink. It will not hesitate. And when the moment comes, it will strike. Because in a world where the seas have become the front lines, closing your eyes is not an option. If you believe that America's strength must never be silenced, then stand with us. Like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because only together can we keep these untold stories alive.